Welcome to Restoring Black History, one gravestone at a time, and my journey to be enlightened by the truth. This is The Grave Truth. Eddie Nance was born on June 12, 1917 in Sebring, Florida. He came from unknown beginnings because his parents are not listed in any online documents. He was raised by a loving adoptive mother and worked his whole adult life in the orange groves of Central Florida. Eddie doesn't appear in any records until 1930 at the age of 13. However, I found his adoptive parents in the 1920 census, so that's where we begin. We find Joe Nance, age 28, working as a carpenter, his wife, Lily Kirkland Nance, age 30, and their two children, a daughter, Arowintha, age 14, and a son, Stanley, age 8. Both children were born in Florida. Also, Joe, Lily, and their kids are all listed as being mulatto on the census. Lily's half-brother, William Kirkland, age 40, was also living with them at this time. He's listed as being a black man, and he shares the same father with Lily but had different mothers. In 1930, Eddie appears in the census for the first time. He's about 13 and mentions his birth parents only as being born in the U.S. It doesn't list the states where they're from, which is the standard. So I'm assuming he didn't know that information. He was living in Dade City, Florida, with his adoptive parents, Joe and Lily, along with their daughter, Earthia Nance, age 23, who was a school teacher. 5 years later, in 1935, Eddie is 18 years old, still living with his mom, Lily, who's now listed as being a widow. That initially told me that her husband, Joe, would have died sometime between the 1930 and the 1935 census. But we found out later that that wasn't the case. This census also tells us that Lily had a 5th grade education, she owned her home, and Eddie was in school at the time. 5 years later, in 1940, Eddie was about 22 years old and was now living in a rooming house in Dade City with many other lodgers, or renters as we would now call them. He was an orange picker by trade, presumably at a nearby orange grove, which was a very common profession in the area where he lived. I also found his adoptive mother, Lily, still living in Dade City with her stepdaughter, Caritha Weston, age 16. In December of that year, Eddie registered for the World War II draft. At that time, he was temporarily living in Tarpon Springs with a T.J. Belcher. On the draft card, he named his mother as next of kin, and the employer was left blank, which becomes understood on the backside of the card. When you turn the card over, he's described as being Negro, 6.5 feet tall, 180 pounds, with brown eyes and black hair. The card is signed by the registrar of the county jail in Dade City. It's unknown why he was arrested or how the case was resolved, but since he was accounted for on the census, which was taken in April of 1940, and he registered for the draft from jail in December, he was obviously arrested sometime before December, but after April 17th. On August 18th, 1942, at the age of 25, Eddie enlisted in the Army at C.P. Blanding in Florida. The enlistment record showed he was single with no dependents and a fruit farm hand by trade. 2 years later, in July of 1944, at the age of 27, he shows up in a World War II Army hospital. He was diagnosed with metatarsalgia, which is when the ball of your foot becomes painful and inflamed. He was ultimately discharged from the Army in December of 44. In the same month, on December 16th, Eddie married Miss Mahaly Williams, age 27. At that time, they were already living together on Duval Street in Dade City. His occupation was listed as U.S. Army, and her occupation was a cafe worker. However, they got married in Duval County, where Jacksonville is, so I would assume that was where the hospital was located, and the reason for getting married out there and not in his hometown of Dade City. Eddie appears again in the 1947 city directory as working as a fruit picker and living in the Tarpon Springs area again. In 1950, he's now 30 years old, living back in his hometown of Dade City, and he's listed as being separated and working as a truck driver for the citrus groves. He's living with his mother, Lily, her daughter, Arowintha Nance Campbell, now age 41, and her husband, Prime Campbell, who's also a citrus fruit picker by trade. There are also 2 lodgers living at the residence, presumably renting rooms to help with expenses. Interestingly, in 1953, when Eddie would have been about 33, he was witness to a murder of a fellow Orange Grove worker while at a pool hall in Tarpon Springs, and testified at the trial of the accused. The article reports that Lovett Albury, age 19, shot and killed George Oliver, age 31, in a pool room. For the next 20 years, Eddie doesn't appear in anything documented online until his death on April 29, 1970. He was only 53 years old, and I couldn't find a death certificate or an obituary to provide more information on how or where he died. But we know he's buried at the Trilby African American Cemetery, also known as the Trilby Colored Cemetery, which is not far from his hometown of Dade City. 5 years after Eddie's death in 1975, his adoptive mother, Lily Nance, passed away. Her obituary lists many family members, including her foster grandchildren, Mr. and Mrs. Eddie Starks and Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Lyles, which makes me wonder if they are Eddie's children, even though I couldn't find any records showing he had any kids. If not, they're probably the grandkids of other children that she may have fostered during her lifetime. Now, since Eddie's biological parents are unknown, I went back to see if I could find anything about Miss Lily Kirkland Nance's history, because I can only imagine she was a sweet, loving woman who cherished her family and opened her heart and home to adopt and raise Eddie. What I found was an unfortunate but very common history of where her last name originated and what life was like for her and her elders. Lily Kirkland was born on January 27, 1890. We know from the 1910 census that she was born in Florida and that her father was born in Georgia and her mother was born in Florida. Her father was Isaac Kirkland, a mulatto man who could not read or write and grew up working on a farm in Georgia. Her mother was Angeline Baisden, who was born and raised in Hernando County, Florida. We start in the 1870 census, where her father, Isaac, is an 18-year-old man, was living with Mr. Levity Brown, a 50-year-old black man who also could not read or write and was a farm worker by trade. They were living in the Militia District 49, which is a neighborhood of Emmanuel County, Georgia. Something important to note here, there's a family of white Kirklands on the very next page of this census and living in the same neighborhood. They are Henry Kirkland, age 28, Mary Kirkland, age 26, and their kids, George, Wright, and Sarah. Henry Kirkland owned his home and was working at a steam mill at the time. They went on to have a total of 10 children. We can also go back another 10 years to 1860 in the same county of Emmanuel, Georgia, to find Henry's parents and siblings. Remember, right now we're focusing on the white Kirkland family line. Henry came from a wealthy family who owned and worked their farm. They are listed as A.L. Kirkland, also known as Abraham, age 59, a farmer, a high-valued property. Needless to say, he would have been considered a wealthy man at the time. There's also Eliza, his wife, age 53, and their children, Benjamin, Henry, Isabella, George, and Jane. In the same year, in the Georgia slave schedules, Abraham owned 23 slaves over 2 properties in this Georgia county. Since the records we have of Isaac, Lily's father, place his date of birth at around 1855, that would make him about 5 years old, plus or minus a year or two, in 1860. So, although Isaac was listed as being mulatto, it's probable that he is the 6-year-old boy listed on the slave schedule. We go back another 10 years to the 1850 census in the same county to find Henry's parents and 6 siblings. And in the 1850 slave schedule, Abraham owns 10 slaves at that time. He also owns several other large pieces of land in the county, each with slaves working the farms. Clearly, this white Kirkland family goes back several generations living in Emmanuel County, Georgia, and living on farmland that they owned. Knowing that Isaac, Lily's father, was a mulatto man born and raised in the same county and a farmer by trade leads me to believe that he was born on Abraham Kirkland's farm. I'll go a step further and say, because he is always listed as being mulatto and not Negro, that he's probably related to the white Kirklands in some manner. Ultimately, Lily Kirkland's family tree traces her roots all the way back to 1830, where a white Abraham Kirkland bought property in Emmanuel County, Georgia, got married, and had a lot of children. He was a Confederate soldier in the Civil War and owned slaves from 1830 until emancipation in 1865. Within that time, in 1855, a mulatto, Isaac Kirkland, was born into slavery on the white Kirkland farm and worked on the farm until he was ultimately freed. He then went to work on a black man's farm, Mr. Levity Brown, in the same county, saved enough money to eventually buy his own property, and then in the 1880s moved to Florida. There he married Angeline, bought a new property of his own, and had children, including Lily, who later adopted Mr. Eddie Nance, the star of today's video. Now, moving forward in Lily Kirkland's life, her first husband was James Weston. They were married in September of 1905 in Pasco County, Florida. We also know that, interestingly enough, remember in the 1935 and 40 censuses, Lily was listed as being a widow, but in the 1950 census, she is listed as being divorced. I found a record that shows her and Joe Nance were divorced in 1945 in Pasco County, Florida. My assumption there is that Lily had to state that she was a widow for many more years because he probably abandoned her, and after 15 years of being absent, she was finally able to get a divorce. One other piece of history regarding Miss Lily was that in June of 1931, she gave a presentation at the Dade City School Board meeting, requested the removal of J.D. Moore, the current principal of the Dade City Colored School, and to be replaced by Miss Etta Burt, shown in the photo. It seems that Lily was also actively involved in her community. Eddie Nance came from unknown beginnings, was raised by a loving adoptive mother, worked long, hard hours in the orange groves, joined the Army and was honorably discharged, and died too young at the age of 53. His story is similar to so many who were raised in blue-collar, low-income, southern, segregated towns. But these workers helped to make what the town is today. To visit Dade City today, it's made up of beautiful farms, lots of stores that sell antiques, and charming small businesses, restaurants, and coffee shops. Check out my other video all about the cemetery that Eddie is buried in, called the Trilby Colored Cemetery. It is in disrepair, to say the least. Most of the gravestones are illegible. Over 100 of them are completely gone. And that's why we're bringing these people's stories back to life. Rest in peace, Eddie Nance, and the people who came before you.